All right. I've decided for this week that I'm going to resume the lecture series that we began a few weeks ago, which is looking at technology and, in particular, its human, social, ethical, existential, and political impacts. And we spoke a little bit about this in the last couple of weeks and thinking about what happened with the siege of Congress and the fact that it was primarily organized online and, in a sense, motivated by ideas about fraud in the election that really only gain their plausibility in a 21st century media environment in which anybody can post anything online and you can really limit your diet of media consumption to things that confirm what you already believe. And so I want now, as opposed to thinking about the most contemporary implications of this, to pull back and look a little bit about the trends that have been happening in the evolution of our media environment and our media consumption habits, and some of the ways of thinking about our current relationship to technology. Before I do that, I do obviously want to focus a little bit about what's been happening in the political world, because a little bit has been happening. There's a different president in the White House than there was last time we spoke. I've got Nina Simone's "It's a New Day" ringing in the background of my head as I say those words. And so we've had a few days of President Biden and his administration. What happened with the inauguration and with the transition? So I recognize that what I'm showing you on the screen looks a little bit like the credit card contract you're sometimes asked to sign, right? Which is to say, there's a lot of fine print. And that's because a lot happened in Biden's first 2.5 days in office. And so I will talk about that in a moment. I want to start with the inauguration and with the themes that Joe Biden struck during the inauguration. And I want to suggest two essential themes. One of them is unity. And here I want to be clear that the line that struck me as most essential from his inaugural address was that politics does not have to be a raging fire destroying everything in its path, right? And so this idea that by unity we don't mean we all get along, we all hold hands, we never disagree, but that we work through our disagreements in the recognition that we are all citizens of the same country, that we all share a commitment to democracy, and that commitment includes reconciling our differences with civility, deliberation, and compromise. So it's, I guess, a 21st century conception of unity. And as we will see, sometimes unity and diversity are understood to be countervailing values, right? There's been an awful lot of emphasis on diversity in the way in which Biden constituted his cabinet and in the executive actions he took in his first couple days in office. So I don't think this is 1950s unity, but the idea that we share enough in common that we can work together across partisan divides is clearly the message that Biden wants to hang his administration on, and in a sense to begin to hold legislators accountable if they continue to treat policymaking as a blood sport in which either you win or you are an abject failure, right? And so that's one theme. The other theme, and I don't think it's incompatible, but I do think it's striking in its contrast, is discontinuity, right? That in a sense, what happened to the United States for the last 4 years under the leadership of President Trump is an aberration, is something that is in fact pathological, and that Biden represents a return to normality. Part of that normality is unity, but what I've been describing, you might maybe call it better comity, right? The idea that you can get along even with those you disagree with and work with them. Um, that what we see or saw under Trump was an acceleration of existing trends toward negative and affective partisanship, towards viewing the other side as the enemy, as an existential threat. And that is, in fact, something that we need to turn away from in order to be able to govern ourselves successfully. And that, in a sense, the culmination of the trends in our politics that have really been there for 20, 40, 50 years is what happened on January 6th. And so if we are frightened by the idea of citizens mobilized to attack their own democratic government by their own elected leader, then we need to recognize that's not just a one-off event. That had a long history in deep trends in our politics. We need to turn away from that. And so I think those are good, interesting, productive themes that Biden raised. We will have to see how they play out in the next year or two, whether in fact he's able to reset American politics. It's a big undertaking. The other thing I would just emphasize very quickly, and we've talked about this before under the rubric of intersecting crises, Biden emphasized, right, and he kind of ticked them off in short order. We're in the midst of a pandemic that has killed more than 400,000 Americans. Will have killed more than 500,000 before we have any meaningful relief from the vaccine. Unfortunately, we're really at a stage, I think, that is well described as a race between getting the vaccine out and new variations of the virus spreading that may make the vaccine less effective. We don't know yet whether the new variants are resistant to the vaccine or attenuate the vaccine's efficacy. But if they are more readily transmitted, that in a sense counteracts the efficacy of the vaccine, even if the vaccine helps us to produce a successful immune response to them, right? And so the question is, can we get the vaccine out fast enough to mitigate the spread of the new variants? And this is an essential question. But it's not the only question we face, right? There is widespread economic suffering. You may have seen the December jobs report showed that 140,000 women lost their jobs. This is one of the really striking factors about the coronavirus contraction. The little quip I saw about this the other day is that other economies have a social safety net. America has mothers, right? So we've asked our mothers to take over for school when children are sent home, and the result is that they're out of the workforce. And that's right, one aspect of the economic suffering that the coronavirus contraction has produced. In ways that I've talked with you about at length before, we really have a bifurcated economy right now. And those who have been doing well mainly are able to continue to do well in the coronavirus economy. But those who were in some of the lowest paying, most precarious jobs have in fact been hit hardest by this. And so there's widespread economic suffering. And then we could get into the climate change, right? Which is a slow moving disaster. It's not the pandemic, but it's ultimately going to overwhelm the pandemic in terms of the severity of the suffering, the catastrophic consequences it's going to produce. And then we have a reckoning with racial inequality prompted by the killing of George Floyd and the widespread protests over the summer, right? This is a period of cascading crises. And so when I look over this list, right, part of what I see is a president whose action represents or reflects the urgency of the moment. And that was the other thing I think we saw in his inauguration. And, you know, part of this is, of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic. If you're doing what public health officials tell you to do, you're not going to have a bunch of inaugural balls, right? And far from it, there were no festivities the evening of the inauguration. Joe Biden went to the White House and sat down at his desk and started signing executive orders. I believe 17 in his first evening in the White House, nearly 30 after a day and a half in the White House, right? And so let's go through these very quickly to see what priorities we see reflected in Biden's executive action. And there's a quip from John Podesta: Joseph Biden will not be able to undo everything Trump did in an evening. It will take about 10 days, right? And so I think part of what we're seeing is that Trump ruled primarily by decree, right? That is to say, he did not have the patience, the knowledge, the diligence required for heavy legislative lifts. If we were to talk about the signature legislative accomplishments of the Trump administration, I suspect there are only two. One of them is criminal justice reform. The other is tax reform, so-called, right? The big tax cuts at the end of 2017. Whereas almost everything else his administration is known for is executive action. That includes judicial appointments that really transform the nature of the federal bench. But then that can't be quickly undone by President Biden. But much else that we know the Trump administration and the Trump years for, in fact, was done by executive action. And that means it can be undone by executive action. So very quickly, right, what does Biden do to counteract what Trump did? He rejoins the Paris Climate Accord, right? He rejoins the World Health Organization, day one. Right, and so major reversals in American foreign policy, signaling a much more internationalist or multilateral approach, the end of the America First era. The second thing he does is to undo a whole bunch of the Trump initiatives on immigration, ending the so-called Muslim ban on immigration. You may have seen the article in the Times came out just a little while ago. The happiest people in the world right now are the people who finally can get visas to come to the United States after nearly 4 years of being locked out. Undoing the draconian immigration enforcement, as well as the construction of the border wall, ending the so-called national emergency on immigration, restoring DACA, which of course Trump tried repeatedly to end, but it got caught up in court. Biden has said we will continue deferred action for childhood arrivals. So-called dreamers will not be deported by his administration. And then including non-citizens in the census count, that's been caught up in court, but Biden has said we will not even try to do that. We will return to the norm that the census counts people, not citizens, as the Constitution says. Third area is to do with discrimination, and in particular, ordering that discrimination be prohibited on the basis of gender or sexual identity in the federal government. That's, in a sense, enforcing Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which Trump had said that his administration did not need to do, restoring diversity and inclusion training, rescinding the Keystone Pipeline permit and the permit for drilling the Arctic Wildlife refuge, right? Reversing the rollbacks on vehicle emission standards, restoring the size of national monuments. And I want to be as clear as possible about this. One way to think about what's going on is there's kind of a zigzag in the American state right now between administrations. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. Does that mean that Biden undoes everything that Trump did? And I think the clear answer to that is no, right? To the extent that, for instance, many more greenhouse gases escaped from, for instance, methane and propane drilling rigs as a result of the relaxation of those regulations under Trump, those gases stay in the environment. And so while the policy can change on a dime, the effects of the previous policy may remain in place. Similarly, to the extent that there have been people deported under Trump that would not have been deported under Biden, they are unlikely to return to the country. To the extent that there have been children separated from their parents who we can now no longer unite, that can't be undone. And so when Podesta says with a certain amount of glee, everything that Trump did will be undone in 10 days, yes, in terms of policy, not necessarily in terms of human or environmental impact. Ending the 1776 commission, I imagine many of you heard about this. Frankly, it was thrown together in a hurry to try to counter the New York Times 1619 project, right? And without going into the details, this is revisionist history at its worst, trying to argue that slavery was not so bad or so important to the United States. And although the report has been written, and although it will give talking points to a certain kind of cultural conservative probably for a while, the commission has now been disbanded, imposing new ethics rules, essentially restoring good governance rules, and freezing all new Trump regulations. And so when I say new, right, Trump and his administration tried to do a lot on the way out the door in order to hamstring or shackle the incoming administration. And Biden has ordered all of those new executive orders to be frozen. Let's now talk about the stuff that isn't just counteracting Trump, right? So that's a whole bunch of stuff, but that is, in a sense, using executive power to immediately set the course of the new administration, and with it, perhaps the course of the country. So a raft of new executive orders concerns the pandemic, right? And he's appointed a new response coordinator. He has created a mask challenge for the next 100 days. By the way, I don't know if you saw, the public health official was reported in the press yesterday as saying if every American wore N95 masks everywhere they went in public for 40 days, the pandemic would be over, right? And obviously, we don't all have access to N95 masks, but it's an indication of what has succeeded in other countries and what could succeed here in getting the pandemic much better under control. Biden is challenging all of us to be masked everywhere we gather for the next 100 days. He's also putting mask regulations in place on federal property and for interstate travel. I think the big deal here is airplanes, also trains and buses. But airplanes in particular have become highly unruly around masks. It's put the airline attendants in a bad position. It also appears to be one way in which the virus spreads whenever people travel en masse around holidays. Restoring the health initiatives on the National Security Council that were disbanded by Trump when he entered office. And this is important, at least for future pandemics and for global cooperation. I don't know how much it will do with the present pandemic, but as I say that, it occurs to me that ultimately the pandemic doesn't come under control until it comes under control globally. And so, although the United States needs to focus in the first instance on bringing it under control domestically, once we succeed at that, we potentially can lead the effort to bring it under control globally. And that's not just a humanitarian initiative. We should be concerned about the virus wherever it's popping up in the world, wherever it's doing the damage that it does. It's also self-interest, right? Because we do live in a globally integrated world. And so if the virus continues to spread in other parts of the world, it will continue to arrive on our shores from those other places. On the economy, I'll get into the $1.9 trillion proposal on stimulus spending in a moment. But in addition to that, and that can't be done through executive order, that has to be done through Congress, through legislation, right? Because it involves new spending. That's something that Congress controls. But through executive power, what Biden is able to do is to extend the evictions and foreclosure moratoriums. Those of you who study Latin will want me to say moratoria, and also the pause on student loan interests and payments will be extended another few months, at least through March. And so some efforts to do what he can via executive power to limit some of the new forms of vulnerability that the pandemic and its contraction are generating, and then a big stimulus package, which will have to go through Congress. There will be new initiatives on the environment as well that will come out via executive order. Immigrations, a lot of this I've covered as being anti-Trump, but it also is its own categories. And race and other equality issues. Biden, in addition to the stuff that he did to prohibit discrimination, has made Susan Rice the head of his domestic policy council and mandated that she work on anti-racism throughout the federal government. And obviously, Susan Rice is a person of very high stature, prestige, power to be put in charge of all of this. So that's to give you a sense of the blitz, the way in which Biden hit the ground running, and the kind of energetic policy executive initiatives that he leads off with in his first couple days of the presidency gives us a sense that Biden sees this as a crisis or a series of intersecting crises, and that we need extreme and immediate action to cope with them. In addition to that, he is not proposing to govern by executive action alone. Clearly, he wants large stimulus legislation, $1.9 trillion, right? And I think it's worthwhile noting that the first stimulus bill was about $1 trillion. The second one was about 900 billion. And so the third one, the one that Biden is proposing, is as big as the previous two combined. What justifies that? Well, I think part of it is the sense that we need to federalize the response to the pandemic, right? And so $400 billion to combat the virus. And that includes using military emergency powers to accelerate vaccine production. It includes stuff to really ramp up the federal tracing efforts, right? Testing and tracing efforts to have a clear picture of which variants of the vaccine are circulating in our society, how it's being transmitted, who's getting it, who needs to shelter or sequester for how long, right? And so part of this is around federalizing the program to combat the virus. But I think in addition, there is the sense that it's likely to be until the end of the year before we can see any prospects or hope of returning to normality. That assumes, of course, that we are successful in combating the virus in this kind of critical phase where we're racing to get the vaccine out before new variants of the virus spread rapidly in our population. But even if we do succeed in that, it's likely to be a year before we can resume normal economic activity. And if we think about the damage that has been done in the last year, and then we compound that by another year's worth of damage, we are talking about lasting, potentially crippling scars on the American economy and, of course, the individuals whose livelihood depends on that economy. And so part of this is to get money out to state and local governments. I've spoken with you about this before. They employ roughly 10% of the workforce in the United States, and they do not have the capacity to engage in deficit spending. So as their tax base contracts, as we continue in a very uneven recession, they are forced to furlough or fire employees. And as they do that, there are ripple effects throughout the economy. Biden is doing what the broad consensus of economists suggests we must do, which is to support state and local governments, and in so doing, to shore up the economy as a whole. He wants to do $1,400 individual stimulus payments. And as much as I might like to get another $1,400, I will be direct in saying that I don't think this is a particularly good idea. And that's not because I'm a deficit hawk. It's because the economic evidence suggests that when you give money to everyone who's doing all right saves the money, right? It doesn't go into the economy. We would be better served spending this money on unemployment benefits or food assistance of one kind or another, on things that target the most vulnerable people, because if they get the money, they will spend the money precisely because they need to spend the money to pay their rent, to buy their food, to maintain their vehicles, to pay for their healthcare expenses, etc. Right? And so although this is popular and it might increase the likelihood that the bill will pass, and so it might be smart to include it in it as a legislative strategy, I don't think it's necessarily especially effective as a stimulus measure. Shoring up unemployment benefits, I'm not going to talk with you about this today. I will talk with you about it at some point in the future. There's all kinds of evidence that the unemployment system in the United States is really failing, right? And the simplest metric would be to say that we put roughly 50% of the money into it today as opposed to what we were putting into it 50 years ago. And that the result is that benefits are 50% less generous. They last less long. They replace less income. There are many people, especially low-income workers, for whom the benefits are so low that it's really not worth the bother of applying to get them. Right, and so one of the things that we'll notice as we get into the details, not today, of this package, is that Biden is trying to do two things at once: respond to an emergency, but also fix structural failings in the American state that are making it hard to combat the virus or respond to the economic damage it's doing. That includes building our national healthcare infrastructure and shoring up not just unemployment benefits, but we can hope the unemployment system going forward. And then looking at small businesses, augmenting and extending the payroll protection plan, which gives small businesses low interest loans that can be converted into grants to retain their employees if their revenues are down as a result of the pandemic. All right, so very quickly, that gives you a sense of the ambition and the specificity of the Biden policy agenda coming straight out of the gates, right? Not waiting even a day to begin responding to what he sees as the urgent emergency and potential catastrophe facing the country. Having said all that, we've got other things to think about here politically for a moment. There's an impeachment trial that's coming up. It appears yesterday that there was a deal worked out between Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell to get it postponed until next month, postponed for roughly 10 days, right? So that's when the House will recommend its impeachment articles to the Senate. When that occurs, the Senate will have to immediately begin hearings. Whether that will be the exclusive business of the Senate or not, we will have to wait and see. I think that in part depends on how long an impeachment trial this is going to be. And that in turn depends on a couple of important issues. One of them is a jurisdictional issue, which will have to be played out either before or during the conviction trial itself, right? And the issue here is the Senate authorized to try a former president, right? Or does it lose its jurisdiction when the president leaves office? A related issue will be counting the votes, right? And to be clear, unless there are 17 Republicans willing to vote to convict, then this is not going to eventuate in a conviction, right? And McConnell is pretty good at counting those votes. And so he will be able to say to Schumer, presumably at some point pretty soon, this is not going to go anywhere, or maybe this will fly. And I think depending upon the answer to that, it may be that the Republicans and the Democrats will either concur on the idea that they lack jurisdiction because this is not going to be a meaningful exercise anyway, or fight out the jurisdictional issue. But all that to say, at the same time that Biden is proposing an ambitious and expensive policy agenda, the Senate is likely to be sidetracked for at least a while by the impeachment trial. If and when we get to an impeachment trial, we'll talk more about that. I now want to talk about a deeper issue here, right? And the kind of fork in the road that Biden faced, and the fact that in a sense he took both paths, right? And what we see with the Trump administration, and I think this reflects the temperament, the disposition, the lack of experience of Donald Trump himself, is a near exclusive reliance on executive action. And what we see with the transition to Biden is that because you relied on executive action, everything you did, or almost everything you did, can be undone via executive action, which is to say that that zigzag path I was talking about, if we change administrations, if we change policies, parties, the leader of the Republican Party replaces the leader of the Democratic Party, or vice versa, we end up with a lot of instability in our policy if everything has been done via executive action. Now, Joseph Biden, having spent the majority of his political career in the Senate, I suspect knows what Lyndon Baines Johnson knew, which is if you want lasting policy change, you have to do the hard work of passing legislation. What are the prospects for Biden getting legislation through Congress? We really don't know yet. I'm going to speak in a moment about McConnell, and he is obviously an extremely important player in this process, right? The Democrats have control over Congress, but they have a rather thin majority, only about 14 in the House, and a razor thin tightrope majority in the Senate, where it's tied 50-50, but Kamala Harris will break the tie, so it'll be 51-50, assuming the votes are in straight party line. And that puts Joe Manchin or another conservative Democrat in the catbird seat. He gets to basically say what works and what doesn't work. And obviously, Biden and the Democrats would prefer not to have Manchin be in the position to veto whatever legislation he wants to veto. Their policy agenda is more ambitious and progressive than Joe Manchin is, right? And so I think another big question will be here, and the Biden administration has been quite clear about this. They're targeting 16 senators, 8 Republicans, 8 Democrats, who they see as potentially a moderate bipartisan working group that they can get to work together to compromise to get some more ambitious legislation through so that it satisfies uh, both parties within that subset of the Senate, right? Not every Republican, but if you can get a certain number of Republicans who are open to persuasion, compromise, working with the other side to come on board, then he may not be held hostage by the most conservative member of his own party. And I think we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski and Mitt Romney as perhaps the members of the Republican caucus in the Senate who are most amenable to working across the aisle and seeing whether Biden can't get them to come into some kind of governing coalition in the Senate. So that leads me then to think about the Republicans. And what seems increasingly clear is that we have a real split within the Republican Party between those who remain loyal to Donald Trump, who remain populist, who remain ethno-nationalist, who remain anti-institutionalist in their bearing. Right. And that does seem to be where the electoral energy is in the Republican Party right now. But you also have the de facto leader of the Republican Party, or maybe de jure would be better, Mitch McConnell. He's still in office, right? Trump is now in Florida. Trump does not hold the levers of governmental power anymore. And the fact that Trump has been banned from Twitter, is currently shut out from Facebook. We'll have to see whether he regains access to that platform or another platform. But the fact that he does not have the cudgel that he has used so effectively for 5 years at his employment anymore is, I think, a very important limit on his ability to use extra institutional leverage at the moment. And so this then elevates McConnell. And McConnell is playing a different game, right? He's interested in working within the institutions to block those things he does not agree with. And so it'll be interesting to see, does the tension between McConnell and Trump leave room for a Collins or a McCloskey to have some autonomy, to have some independence, and to perhaps work with the Democrats on some moderate policy proposals? All of that seems to me what we're looking at as a result of having seen Biden in action for a few days. Now, let me transition into what I want to talk with you about in terms of resuming our lecture series, Alone Together in a Pandemic, right? Thinking about the way in which the pandemic has accelerated our adoption of new technology and what that new technology does to us in terms of our identity, the way we present our identity to other people, the way we communicate, the way we coordinate our action with each other, and ultimately then our sense of community, our society, our politics. And we talked together about what I've called the coevolution of the human condition and technology a few weeks ago, right? The idea that especially intellectual technology, and we've talked about the book, writing, the practice of reading, more recently the map, the clock, and then we could start talking about the car or the television, right? These change our brains, right? We can see in terms of where cognitive activity occurs, how dense the neural networks are, our brains change as a result of learning to read and write, or having to know an awful lot of spatial information that is contained on a map. In a world without maps, in a world without writing, our brains are organized in different ways, right? And so not only does it change our brain structure, it changes obviously the way in which we think, right? If you don't have a written language, what's the point in coming up with a story that nobody can remember, right? That means that your culture is going to be an oral culture as opposed to a written culture. And that means that you're going to perhaps have some lyric poems, but you're not going to have highly involved religious texts, right? So think about what a difference it makes, and how, in a sense, you can't have the great world religions until you have written language, and how much those religions have influenced culture, identity, personality over time. And so without completely reprising all of these ideas, right, the central idea is that when we study technology, we're not just studying technical innovation. We're studying the way in which it changes us as individuals and as societies, the way in which cultural change is often driven by technological change. And so we talked in particular about this metaphor that Walter Benjamin uses in the middle of the 20th century, looking at that Paul Klee poem, which Liz Chamish pointed out to me was referred to in a recent article in the New Yorker, of an angel not using its wings to navigate, but in fact having its wings caught in a storm and being blown out of control. And that, in a sense, Benjamin, in looking at that image as a metaphor for modern history, was suggesting we have lost control of our technology. And I took the wonderful line from Emerson, we are tools of our tools, right? We're no longer using our tools are using us. And so that's where we left off. I had more territory that I wanted to cover. And in the remaining time today, like I say, I do have to go promptly in 15 minutes. Let me talk about two things, and I think I'll do it in reverse order. One of them is the explosion of digital communication technology use, especially social media, in the last decade. And I want to give you some data and some visuals to really represent this. I think we all have an intuitive sense. The world we live in today is very different than the world 10 years ago. And this is one of the things that accelerated technological change does, is it accelerates change in every compartment of human existence. But exactly how has that change occurred? How thoroughgoing is that change? What is it doing to our use of time in daily life? I want to give you some information about that. And then to suggest that these developments, which were already galloping out of control for the last 10 years, have been accelerated and penetrated more and more into our daily lives as a result of the pandemic. And then finally, I want to suggest one analytic framework for thinking about this. And this is the one that was introduced maybe 25 years ago by Neil Postman in a very influential study called Technopoly. So let me jump right in. If you remember, we looked at this together a few weeks ago, and this is the number of transistors on integrated circuit chips. I'm sorry, I know that sounds very technical, but really this is about the power of computational devices. And I know the diagram's a little hard to read, but what you see is in 1970, the most advanced circuitry had about 1,000 transistors on it. And when we get to 2018, and by now even talking about transistors is not accurate. We're talking about microchips, right, that are literally engineered at the molecular level. We're talking about, 50 billion on a circuit chip, right? So this is obviously a chart that is showing exponential growth, right? And that accounts for the exponential growth in computational power. The fact that our computers can now choose our music better for us than perhaps the best DJ, read our medical diagrams for us better than the most experienced doctor or technician, etc., because they process information so quickly and so powerfully that they have a capacity to recognize patterns that really exceeds the cognitive power of the human mind in many respects at this point. And so that's one aspect of this development. And then the other aspect that I think is driving all of this is the degree of interconnectivity, and that is measured by access to the internet. And what we can see is that really only in about 20 years, we've gone from, in the developed world, around 10% of people having access to 80+% of people having access. In the world as a whole, a few percentage points up to around 50%. And even in the developing world, having gone from basically no internet access to more than a third, coming up on almost half your population having internet access. And what internet access does, of course, is allow these handheld devices, which are already dense in circuitry, to connect to much more powerful computers, and then to connect us to all of this computational infrastructure that allows our handheld devices to do what supercomputers can do. And so that's, in a sense, what's driving this revolution. Now let's look at the user side of it. Who's using it and to what degree? And here's an initial way of looking at this. Which social media and digital technology or digital communication technology are people using? And so, number one, Facebook, right, has only existed for a decade. So, right, a decade ago, basically nobody was using it. Today, 2.5 billion people on the planet use Facebook. YouTube, which has been around for a little bit longer, but started in 2006, now has basically 2 billion users. By the way, YouTube is now, of course, owned by Google. WhatsApp, which is a digital communication encrypted technology, again, only around for a little bit more than 5 years, it has 1.5 billion users. And you can see Instagram, WeChat, each have 1 billion. And so we look at the top 5 social media platforms. All of them have more than 1 billion users, and I'm sure it's gone up since 2018 when this data was collected. When we look at the hours spent, and here I'm focusing on the United States, what we have is, right, an exponential growth in time spent on digital technology from no time, essentially 20 years ago, to around 2.5 hours a day a decade ago, to more than 6 hours a day before the pandemic hit. And please note, the growth is really driven by mobile phones, right? Almost all of the growth occurs as a result of the ubiquity of mobile phones in the United States today. This is just another way of looking at the people using the social media platforms. I won't dwell here, but again, in this diagram, we've got 4 platforms with more than 1 billion users each. When we look in particular at young people engaging in social networking online, again, what we see is that it varies a little bit society to society. If we concentrate on the developed world, the average is around 90% of young people, right? So almost everyone using social media. The lowest rate of usage in the developed world is around 3/4. The highest rate of usage in Sweden is almost 100%. If we throw in a developing country for sake of comparison, in Mexico, it's only around 53% of people who are 16 to 24 using social networking technology. When we look at teens usage in the United States, and this diagram compares 2012 with 2018. And what we can, I think, concentrate on is more than once a day. And it used to be that once a day was more common, but still more than once a day was twice as common. Now, once a day is very uncommon, as are all of the other categories, with the exception of people who don't use it at all. And that's probably as a result of a parental prohibition. But what we can see here is that when we look at the people who use social media technology more than once a day, and these are 13 to 17-year-olds, and the reason we concentrate here is because this is such an important period developmentally speaking, right? This is when our brains, our neural connections develop. It's when our social habits take shape. It's when our sense of self develops. And all of that now is being mediated by social media technology. We're not primarily driven in our psychological development by interpersonal connections alone. A lot of the connections that used to be face-to-face are now mediated by technological devices, and that's why we're being changed by this. But if you look at this, 16% of our teenagers are almost constantly on social media. 27% of them are on it at least hourly, right? And so when we speak of it being ubiquitous, when we speak of it penetrating their lives, I ask my students every now and then, how many of you sleep with your cell phones, right? That they put it under the pillow. And how many of you wake up at least once a night to check what's happening on your phone? I almost always get a majority of students saying, yes, I do actually get up in the middle of the night to see what's happening on my phone. When we think about this in one more way, we can think about the pace of adoption of technology. Part of what I'm trying to get us to think about is the relationship between technology and culture. And if we think of this as a complex dialectic in which technology shapes culture, but culture regulates the use of technology, the capacity of culture to develop the resources, and let's be specific, religious and ethical systems, worldviews, broadly disseminated ideas and norms to allow us to shape our technology use, to get us to think through what's acceptable and unacceptable, what's healthy and what's not. The pace in which a technology is adopted gives culture, if it's slow enough, time to develop the resources to regulate the use of the technology. If, on the other hand, the adoption of the technology is very rapid, culture probably doesn't have the time to develop those resources, and the result is that culture is deformed by the technology rather than regulating the technology. So if we now look at the adoption of the radio, right, began to be used quite broadly in the late 1920s, but really didn't become universally available until the late 1960s, early 1970s. So essentially a 40-year ramping up period. If we look at the automobile, right, similarly, it really doesn't become something that is the cultural norm until really 30 years after it becomes available as a consumer commodity. If we look at color television, and what you see, right, as we move across this diagram to the right, the newer the technology is, the quicker its adoption as a nearly universal technology. With the color TV, right, we've got basically a 15 to 20 year period in which it goes from being a brand new innovation to being nearly universal or ubiquitous in our society. And then we get into the newer technology, right, the digital technology. And what you can see here, and I'll just concentrate on this red line, which is the cell phone, though we could like break it down, right? The cell phone goes from being something completely novel. Remember back to the 1990s when there were these huge boxes that people worried about getting brain cancer from using, and it was essentially only investment bankers who had them, to being something that is nearly ubiquitous in less than a decade. And as it gets out into 15 years, right, it's almost universal. And so the fact that the technology is being adopted so much more quickly gives us less time as a society, as a culture, either to formally regulate it, to change laws, or to informally regulate it, to change norms, customs, manners, ideas. I will stop there. I have just a couple minutes for questions. I'm sorry to be so rushed today, but I do have to go help my students choose classes in just a couple minutes. Who wants to start us out with a thought, a comment, a question? I see I've got something in the chat bar already from Bob. His says, my great concern is the disparity between the treatment of the white insurrectionists and the Black Lives Matter protesters. And I did say a little bit about that in a lecture a couple weeks ago. I do agree with you, Bob, but we will have to wait and see. I think on the one hand, we're going to have to wait and see what happened with the Capitol Police. Were they simply overwhelmed and so incapable of responding? You know, there were choices that were made that resulted in them being overwhelmed. And that's why I say we're going to have to wait in order to get reports and studies on what happened. And then the other thing we'll have to wait and see is whether or not the people who trespassed and did damage to and committed homicide while invading Congress are prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And there does seem to be some indication that they will be. But yes, I do think one thing is, you know, really important that we not lose track of. It's the big picture thing, which is that when Black people assemble and protest and march, it inspires fear and a militarized response, which is very different from when white people do the same thing. And that is indicative of a much broader problem in our society. The perception of threat and violence is deeply racially structured. And so the psychology of the police, in a sense, is emblematic for the psychology of our society as a whole, which is strongly racially asymmetrical. Sorry, a little jargony, but I hope you know what I'm saying. Who wants to ask a question? We've got just a minute. You're going to let me go. You're being kind to my students. Flossie says, go. Okay, everybody. Sorry to be rushed today. Good to see you. Keep being safe and smart. And I will look forward to continuing. We're starting to get some traction on the technology stuff. We will continue with that next week. Take care. Be safe. See you all soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
David, have a great weekend.
Thank you, guys. Have a great weekend, too. Bye-bye.